To start with, we're talking about decriminalization of sex work in South Africa. And South Africa has a very, very violent history and her story. And her story is something that I talk about in my book on her story of South Africa. And it's a society that is very, very violent and it's traumatized. And this has happened both before and after apartheid. So in post-apartheid South Africa, what is happening is that women are having to navigate security and terror. And this is one of the most striking features of the post-apartheid era and the politicization of sexuality, according to Posel. So I always ask the question, like, what has changed for women? What has actually changed for women in South Africa? And also what has changed for sex workers in South Africa? Basically, in Africa is a rich legacy of women who've contributed to annual anti-colonial resistance movements, and they've played an incredibly important role in the struggle against apartheid, according to Missy Mung, a women's activist. And one of the questions that I kind of was going to pose to you was like, how many women do you know who have fought against apartheid? How many women can you name? I know you can probably name Nelson Mandela, but I mean, are there other names that you can think of? Be people like Albertina Sisulu, Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Winnie or Minnie Mandela, you probably know, and Annie Selinga. And these are some of the women that, just some, are very, very, very few of the women who have helped to fight apartheid. And they struggled and challenged the apartheid system against a background of colonialism and political challenges, very severe political challenges. So women's defiance against the past laws actually started in 1913, well before the men started their protest. And they have a very strong tradition of protesting and defiance. And they were at the forefront of mass action. And voluntarily, this is voluntary, they set aside the fight for gender equality because they thought racial equality should maybe come first. And they did this whilst maintaining their identity as mothers and wives. However, their voices against the violent sexism in South Africa and within the political liberation movements, they were dismissed by the male colleagues who insisted that the main concern should be the struggle against apartheid, and that then, when this was done, the women could then be could sort of getting their turn to think about gender equality. Well, I don't know if that's actually happened, and I don't think it's actually even happening now. So it was in 1943, only then, that the African National Congress allowed women full access to the ANC membership. But the organization was very male dominated and also very patriarchal. And this, kind of simmering below all this, you had the misogyny, power, domination, and patriarchy. All these are simmering underneath, during apartheid. So coming through all this, we have the feeling that women were inferior to men, and women were oppressed in many, many ways. They were oppressed by the political system, by the the ANC political system, all the other political systems. They were oppressed by the fact that they couldn't always get jobs, etc. So they were oppressed 4 or 5 times. They were oppressed. So when they were interrogated, when these women activists were interrogated by the special branch, they were called prostitutes, and they were stripped naked and made to appear in front of a policeman who made derogatory comments about their bodies. And many of these political activists suffered tremendous brutality in the police cells and in isolation, and and if you read Ankie Krog's book Country of My Skull, you will find, read things about how their fallopian tubes were filled with water and sometimes rats inserted into their vaginas. So these are the hideous things that these women sort of underwent, and nobody really knows about it. So if you go to Johannesburg, you'll see the men's prison, and it's like big, massive sort of place. When you go to look at the women's prison, it's very small, and a lot of people kind of miss it out because they don't know. But when you stand there and you look at the cells, you can see, how these women have actually suffered within these cells. And the police were very upset when a female activist did not sort of like break under the torture. And they used to call her derogatory names like "cuffer mate," and because they said they didn't have the right to withstand them. So if you go on to the next slide, um, this is the slide that shows the next one. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
This is just to show you where some of the shacks are, where the women live, where and where they, this is this is where they're living in the shacks. These are the children, and and then we've got solidarity with shack dwellers in South Africa. So these sex workers live with, in that kind of environment. There's a massive issue in South Africa with unemployment and a lack of education and a lack of food. So there's nothing there to kind of help build strong family life ties and community life. So post-apartheid, this is what's happened to the women. Okay, they actually suffer from all these particular um, hardships, such as the unemployment, lack of education, and lack of food. So when you talk about sex workers, the discourse is replete with narratives of risk and danger, and also links them to violence and disease. But nobody talks about the risks that sex workers experience from the police. And this is maintained by the criminal justice system. It's sanctioned by the state, and the criminal laws and the licensing laws and the targeted policing get very, very less attention. So Mabandla's comment that even though women have been, integral to the struggles against apartheid, struggles against racism, colonialism, and fascism, but the struggle for their emancipation, the struggle for women's emancipation, is one of the longest struggles that's ever been waged. So the next slide is, you can use the next one. So in South Africa, as one of the highest rates of violence against women in the world. And in my book, which is about the her story of South Africa, I say that men are waging a civil war against the bodies of women. They're kind of waging this war on the bodies of women. And critical criminology critiques the structural and racist processes and could predominantly inform policies on sex workers, as well as adding to the discourse on oppression and exploitation. Now, President Ramaphosa said South Africa is in the grip of a relentless war being waged on the bodies of women and children. But yeah, he didn't actually accredit that comment to me, which I think he must have got from somewhere. Anyway, so despite the government's best efforts, perpetrators show no sign of abating this violence against women. And so we have said, he says, we have said before, the violence perpetrated by men against women in this is the second pandemic that our country must confront. And like the COVID-19 pandemic, it can be overcome if we all work together, which sounds very wonderful. It's not working, and it's not the second pandemic. It is definitely the first pandemic. It's been there for a long, long time, and it's still there today as we're speaking. So South Africa's socio-political history has fostered a culture of violence, inequality, and femicide is rife. It is absolutely rife, and violence against women is normalized. So if you have 3 women standing in a row, 2 women will probably have been raped. And that is the height of the violence in South Africa. And this violence is woven deeply, deeply, deeply into the fabric of South African society. And gender-based violence is an intense and widespread problem. It's impacts almost every aspect of life. Okay, the next slide. So my research in Cape Town was part of a 3.7 million pound grant focusing on globalization and decriminalization of sex workers and their health and well-being. It was part of a massive project which took in Bangladesh, which took in Mexico, which took in Brazil, South Africa, the UK. So there were like five areas. So poverty in the sub-Saharan Africa, sub-Saharan South Africa, and the women's lack of employment opportunities makes sex work one of the few options they have for survival. We call it survival sex. It's a means of surviving. They work in very dangerous environments, very, very dangerous environments in the dark because they want to escape public scrutiny. They don't want the public to actually, to be able to point them out. But, so they go into dark areas to try and find clients. Now, South Africa, the sex workers work very, very much not to kind of like buy clothes for themselves, but to support their children, not only their own children, there's their brothers' children, their sisters' children, their mothers and their fathers. They want to support, their family. They go out and they support and they provide money for food, for shelter, for education, and they have to keep the sex work secret. So they go out at night, they go out when it's dark and into the most obscure places. And why is this so? Now, the sex work project with Sweat is called the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force, and I did this with Cape Town University as well. So it was like a three-way project. So, as Sweat has a 20-year history of organizing sex workers and advocating for and delivering services to sex workers. It's an amazing organization. It has creche, it has advocacy work. It is a very big organization and an amazing organization to work with. And Dudu, who you will see when we show the videos, is one of the main women linked with this organization. And the organization's vision is a South Africa where people who choose to sell sex are able to enjoy freedom, rights, and human dignity. So the project was an interdisciplinary, innovative approach to drawing primarily on arts and the humanities, as well as the social sciences and criminology and gender studies. So it was, took in a vast range of various academic subjects. But what we wanted to do was to create creative interventions, but also enabling a space that was safe for the sex workers and to encourage a dialogue around equality issues in socio-economic and political areas that would support sex workers, and give them empowerment, and also think about gender positive approaches to their health and well-being. So we did this through audio-visual representations, narratives, and participatory theatre. Okay, the next one. Mhm. So after apartheid, we wanted to, there was no personal respect for choices about sex and relationships. So one of the things were they were trying to, because of the Immorality Act, during apartheid, where you couldn't, people of various different races weren't allowed to have sex. They were like really strong on getting respect for per people's personal choices regarding sex and relationships, and but this has not happened for sex workers, and they've been sanctioned vehemently. So what happens? All aspects of sex work is criminalized. All of it is criminalized, and they define sex work as sexual services in exchange for financial reward between consenting adults. So it's very much remains as being something that is being criminalized. Now you have sex workers who then end up with a criminal record, okay, which is great, okay, except that when you have a criminal record, it makes it even more difficult to find work in a country where there is no work, and very, very difficult to find work. So the criminal record under the Sexual Offences Act of 1957, and then you have the criminal law, the Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amended Act of 32 in 2000. So it's very, very, this is something that's really, really, really criminalized in South Africa. And, and it denies sex workers the right to work and also the right to their bodily autonomy and agency. So they're looked upon as being collateral damage in public policy. And the criminalization of sex work kind of relies very much on the moral precepts of what women should be and what women should be permitted to do with their bodies. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so according to Sweat, and according to sex workers I worked with, and according to Sisonke, which is another amazing organization, sex work is work, and this is something that they talk about vehemently, and this is the fact that what they want to do with their body is their business, and sex work is work. It's a form of labor, and and they have to think about what are the harms related to being a sex worker. But the state does not only relate to the selling of sex, but to the laws. And the police play a very large role in creating harm for sex workers. But the idea of the whole moral concept is that sex workers are regarded as offenders and they should be punished. They are immoral and they should be kicked basically out of society. So the South African Police Service, after apartheid, said that they would serve the community in a manner that is consistent with human rights and democratic values. Well, this has not happened for sex workers. They found that the police are engaging in unlawful and unconstitutional acts when arresting sex workers. They are criminalized, they are victimized, they were abused, assaulted, raped, and also murdered. So next slide. I'm 4 years old and I do sex work for 18 years now. Portia says she is tired of sex work. She's ready to retire to a big house with a big car. And now she does sex work to enable her children to be educated because she doesn't want them to have to do sex work. It's not easy, but you get used to it and it's your job. Next slide. Talking with sex workers provided me with a very kind of disturbing insight into their life. They were suffering from poverty. As I said before, it's survival sex. And they were forced to do sex work. And sometimes this culminated in taking drugs. Okay. So some of the sex workers that we worked with had been taking drugs, but we managed to get some of them off taking drugs. They used to smoke something called tuk. So the hegemonic risk discourse highlights this issue of blame the victim perspective. And sex workers are blamed. What are they blamed for? They're blamed for spreading disease and they are stigmatized really, really badly. But they do sex work in a climate of severe poverty. And this provides them with the means of life and very much to provide an education for their children. They are usually poor and the black female, and they say, and they sell sex, as I said before, to support their families and other dependents. Now, these labels, these criminalization of sex workers gives them labels, and this results in stigma. And the stigma is disproportionate. It ends in disproportionate violence against sex workers. And because of this, it enables the law enforcement officials to abuse their power. And they engage in very unlawful, as I said, unconstitutional acts when arresting sex workers. So when they get put in prison, they are sometimes, and more than sometimes actually, raped within the prison. Next slide. Sometimes they ask for sexual favors in the cells. One policeman will come to the cell and he would choose one of the sex workers to have sex with, and then if that sex worker agrees to have sex with him, they will all be freed. but if she doesn't, then they will have to stay in the police cell. So when there were three sex workers were arrested and taken to the cells, one person was released. And when we asked the police officer why, he said that the other police officer and the other sex worker were having sex. And this, it's actually rape of the sex workers. And they think that the sex workers cannot be raped. But of course, a sex worker has the right to say no. The criminalization of sex work has resulted in a lack of essential human rights protection for sex workers. They don't have the right to human dignity, body or physiological integrity. Their access to healthcare is dreadful, and the right to be free from all forms of violence, freedom of expression, and the right to privacy, and their right to movement, amongst others. So the government basically of South Africa has failed to provide financial security to sex workers. So why do sex workers continue to do sex work? Because of the extreme levels of unemployment, and this just provides them with money. I'm kind of repeating this because these sex workers aren't there to kind of do sex work to kind of like buy a new car, to do this, to do that. It is actually survival sex. So the undermining of sex workers denies them access to justice for crimes committed against them. They're not able to call out the police abuse and exploitation. They have no expectations of the police to protect them, and police corruption and violence is recognized in many areas of South Africa. But sex workers, you know, don't count. They're looked upon as trash. They're exceedingly vulnerable, and they have no rights, no legal rights um, to 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 redress these issues. Um, Next slide. The femicide is endemic and, as I said, normalized, and sex workers are stripped of their right to live in work and safety. And it forces them, as I've said before, to work in areas which are very dangerous. They're more likely to be murdered and raped. So we have the threat has and Sisonke have a campaign which says "Say Her Name," and "Say Her Name" is organized to protect and uphold the sex workers' human rights and the freedom from violence and access to justice, and to remember those who have been killed, but not only to remember them, but to humanize sex workers. So they're not just trash, they're not just things, objects, whatever. They are humans, and they should have rights, and they should have human rights and access to protection and access to the law. The next slide is about remembering Robin, and she was a sex worker who was killed. So you can just read that for a moment, and you can, it's remembering sex workers who are murdered, and many are murdered. Many of them are never found. Many of them are never even acknowledged. Never, they might come from a different country or wherever. They come to South Africa to do sex work, and they may never be seen again. So many of them are never even missed. Okay. All right. The next slide. Whorephobia is a fear or a hatred of sex workers, and this is manifested in many ways. It can be in legislation, the public consciousness, medical publications, and how the law reacts to sex workers, and also how the public respond to sex workers. There's aggressive policing, the extortion, and increased health risk, especially when the police remove the condoms, because this kind of exposes them to various sexual health issues such as STI, chlamydia, AIDS, and various others. Also, the psychological diseases, poor self-esteem, loss of family and friends. And I mean, while we were doing this project, one of the sex workers was killed, and one sex worker died from AIDS, and then a couple of months later, one of the women I worked with really closely, she unfortunately died in a traffic accident. So you can see that the work-related mortality is really high. It is something that people are not really aware of, but it is really, really, really high. And also they don't feel safe when reporting violence and rape. Okay, so the sex workers interviewed for okay, sorry, the next slide. Okay, this is about Sifuso sorry, I can't hardly see it, Makubagani. He was guilty of murdering and raping 6 Johannesburg sex workers. And this is a recording. Can you play the recording?
My suggestion is that maybe you come to an end and then I stop sharing the PowerPoint screen
Okay.
and we look at the videos that you were,
Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All
Can I
right.
just
Okay.
check how long the videos are?
They're only a few minutes, and I'll tell you where to stop them. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
So in that case, I would say maybe take another few minutes
Okay.
to
I will
wrap
do.
up
I
the
will.
spoken
Yeah.
presentation, and then we have time to share the videos and also hopefully for
Okay.
Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll talk about the next slide then. Yeah. Okay, so that's so this was about another woman who was murdered by a very well-known artist in South Africa, and they pushed and pushed and pushed, and anyway, this artist was then found guilty. You know, he arrived in his Porsche to pick her up, and then he beat her to death. Okay, so the female sex workers in South Africa, they have a very high prevalence of HIV. And now to get the healthcare, I'll just go through this very quickly. There's it is very, very difficult. So they because they become the drivers of stigma, including the collaboration with law and enforcement and policy. This kind of doesn't support the reduction of punitive measures taking against sex workers. So they're very, very, very open to this exploitation. They also found that, when they go for screening rates and they talk about and they mention that they're sex workers, they are not given the proper health care that they should do. Okay, so let's have a look here. So the criminalization of sex workers does not actually deter. Do you want to just go on? We'll go on. There we are, stigma, and then we'll just go on to the next one. Okay, so we've got this, because sex workers are thought of as a nuisance. So we've got to get them out of the community. We've got security people, in various areas in South Africa, in various towns. And when they see somebody that they think is a sex worker, they they can tell them to get out of the property, get out of the street. And very often these are not sex workers; these are domestic workers. And so they get sort of conflated, the two kind of identities. So why should sex work be decriminalized in South Africa? Because of the human rights, and Human Rights Watch suggests that sex workers are targeted for arrest because police either know them from previous contacts or believe they match the profile of a sex worker, not because they've actually engaged in any illegal arrests. So every sex worker interviewed for the report said that their arrest or being detained for police was apparently nothing to do with where they were working or where they were not working, because they, were already known to the arresting police officers. Very much the sex workers have come from families where they've been traumatized, raped by my stepfather, and had 2 children, by the stepfather. And when she tried to speak out, she was threatened with death. And he went to tell the police, and the police said that she was very provoking to her parents. So she ran away, and then, of course, started to do sex work. Sex work should be decriminalized because the sex workers have a fear that their children would find out what they're doing and would discover that they were doing sex work. So what they say is like, we want sex work to be decriminalized so that the children won't be decriminalized because of what they're doing. And one of the sex workers that I worked with in Cape Town, She was actually living in the bush, but she was doing sex work and sending the money to her mother, who was looking after her daughter, so that her daughter could have a decent education. But somebody in the school, they found out that her mother was a sex worker, and this, caused her tremendous, grief and issues, and she started being, being judged and being, kind of like sort of like they kind of sort of started taking action against the daughter. So what we could say here is they've talked about all that. Let me just mention that very quickly. And so yes, so basically we think that the sex workers should be decriminalized. Sex work should be decriminalized because sex workers need to be protected. They are very, very vulnerable. They need to find a way of working so that they can support their families, their children, their mothers, their fathers, and they need to have they need to have proper health care. They need to have safe and effective sexual health care services for both male, transgender, and female sex workers. It's a human right. They need to be protected from HIV and sexually transmitted infections. They need to move away from this issue of stigma, because this is a very predominant barrier and divides divides them in relation to their sexuality, gender identity, and status for work, and it internalizes the stigma. And it'll also help in issues of confidentiality and enable more of a positive attitude towards sex workers. So full discrimination is something that we need to do in South Africa because it seems to be the right path forward. Not the Nordic model or any of the other models, but the New Zealand model, and we need to work with that, and we need to encourage the decriminalization of sex work. And